We're going to get started. Thanks everyone for your patience, for joining us. I'm really looking forward to this discussion of a workers' Green New Deal. This is the second in a series of teach-ins on the People's Green New Deal, which is the most recent issue of our Science for the People magazine. My name is Rebecca. I'm one of the members of the Climate Change Working Group of Science for the People. And I want to take a moment today to tell you that I'm speaking to you today from the unceded land of the Mohawk and Mohican people of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I invite you to join me in acknowledging their communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. And I invite you to acknowledge the heritage of the land from which you're joining this call today as well. All right, just to give a few introductory notes before we get started. This teach-in series is being made possible through the tremendous efforts of people from the editorial collective of the Science for the People magazine's issue of A People's Green New Deal, as well as the Climate Change Working Group. If you're interested in getting involved with the Science for the People activities, the editorial collective, or for a future issue of the magazine, or the Climate Change Working Group, we really invite you to join us. And please check out the chat for some links to get involved. There also will be a link in the chat to subscribe to the Science for the People magazine or to sign up for a special order of a physical copy of the People's Green New Deal issue. There are a couple questions about if this session will be recorded. Yes, it's being recorded, just so you're all aware. If you're interested in finding a recording of this session after the fact, it will be on the Science for the People magazine YouTube channel. So you can check it out over there. Within this teach-in series, we'll be engaging with a variety of our magazine contributors, as well as other thinkers and activists who are working on a wide-ranging set of issues surrounding what a Green New Deal looks like, covering labor, energy democracy, agroecology, art, design, as well as international and Indigenous perspectives. In today's conversation, we're going to be focusing on what a Green New Deal looks like from the perspective of workers, particularly public sector unionized workers, and learning about some of the strategies can be used to be applied in the pursuit of that vision. We're joined by some very knowledgeable and experienced comrades who've been working on this issue from different perspectives. So I'll introduce them today one by one and give them about 10 minutes to talk about their work and their campaigns. And then we'll open up space for an audience question answer, and we'll be aggregating questions between Zoom and between our YouTube live stream. So at any point, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and someone will pick them up and we'll make sure to get to them as we have time. Finally, we'll just close with a few closing remarks from each of our speakers, discuss some take-home lessons, and hopefully get inspired for the work to come. So with that, I'm going to turn to Paul Prescott. Paul is a public school teacher and a political liaison with the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers. He's also a contributing editor at Jacobin Magazine. Paul, the floor is yours.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much to Science for the People for putting this event together and inviting me. Just give a warning, my allergies are really doing a number on me today, so I really hope I don't have to pause and sneeze, but that might happen, so just prepare for that. So I'm going to try to cover two topics in my time, and first being the convergence of labor fights happening currently in Philadelphia and the cross-pollination and alliance building that's beginning to happen. So this has been mostly in response to the economic and public health crisis triggered by COVID-19, but ironically on the flip side, it's opened up certain opportunities that I don't think were there before. So first we have what's been happening with our sanitation workers. And unfortunately, there was supposed to be someone from that union on tonight who I don't think can be on. But they've been fighting for hazard pay and protective equipment. And sanitation is already one of the most dangerous jobs in the country. And then when you think about the fact that they're going to everyone's homes now, picking up trash during a pandemic, that's just magnified. And many sanitation workers in Philly have already tested positive for COVID. And so in their fight, you know, they've been campaigning in different ways, doing actions, doing phone banks, things like that. They've really galvanized a lot of people in support and highlighted the issue of workplace health and safety. So through some people in the Philly DSA Labor Committee, which I'm involved with also, have worked with them in their internal organizing. And I think the campaign drew on some of the energy that was already in the air from the Black Lives Matter protests. And many other unions came out in support, like my own union, PFT, UPS, Teamsters Local, Teamsters Rail Division, other city workers, and plenty of other unions. We've also had the attacks on the Postal Service, and this was even before they were delaying the mail, but we still had the issue of Congress providing funding. So we had, Communities and Postal Workers United worked with the Postal Workers Union in Philly to coordinate rallies and have customers, flyering supporters at post offices across the city. And again, you had relationships and alliances being built. So Omar Salam, who was a sanitation worker and business agent in the sanitation local, for example, came to one of these rallies and spoke in support of the postal workers and met some officials in that union. I think the biggest achievement in this flurry of activity was the Essential Worker Protection Act. So this is a municipal level bill that organized labor in Philly worked to pass and has some of the strongest language on occupational health and safety in the country. It gives workers the right to refuse unsafe work and prohibits retaliation against workers that speak up about unsafe working conditions. And we worked with many different kinds of unions and sectors, and we got the whole AFL-CIO to sign on to this bill. And so I think the broader point here is for environmentalists and environmental organizations that want to work with labor is to recognize the context that we're in now. And it's a context of really severe attacks on labor. But if we're involved in these fights, we can leverage these coalitions that we're building now to fight for the stuff, that we want in terms of labor environmental campaigns in the future. And I didn't even talk much about, the economic attacks that are coming. So without massive federal aid, and it looks like we aren't going to get much federal aid, cities and states are really going to try to implement huge austerity programs. And this will especially affect public sector workers and public sector unions. And as a quick aside, I'll just say, I think this is a connection the Black Lives Matter movement has to make, because public sector workers are so disproportionately Black in this country, and public employment has been perhaps the greatest factor mitigating Black poverty historically. So, if we allow this austerity to go through, it's going to really hit Black workers especially hard. And I think this context also points to how we frame the Green New Deal in a moment of, attack on labor and this false scarcity. And I think it's got to be centered around jobs and economic empowerment. But more importantly, there has to be a credible and practical promise of high quality jobs. And I'll give a little anecdote to kind of illustrate this. There's a former steelworker and steelworker union president who I know and have worked with. And this is someone who totally agrees that we need to get off fossil fuels and totally agrees that we can create many more jobs in the green energy sector. But he told me once that we need to find a different term than just transition, because he said, too many energy workers have heard this promise and it's failed and it just seems hollow. So, I couldn't tell you if everyone in labor agrees on this term, just transition. My point really isn't about the semantics, but it's just the fact that we need a credible plan and some very positive local examples to show that the Green New Deal is possible. And I think for many workers, they're at the point where it sounds nice, but it's like, show me that this is real. So that brings me to the second point I want to talk about, and that's this idea around a campaign for green school renovation that I've begun to work on within Philly DSA. So myself and others in DSA were really inspired by the New York Climate Jobs Report, which I think is going to be talked about later. We thought it was exactly what needed to be done, which is to lay out concretely and specifically just how many jobs could be created through a green energy transition. So we want to do kind of a mini version focusing on our public schools. So in Philadelphia and many cities across the country, we have a huge issue with really old buildings that are literally toxic. So mold, lead, asbestos, roofs caving in, buildings without air conditioning, all that sort of thing. So we need new and improved buildings, and we can use this opportunity to build green, energy efficient public schools that would create so many jobs without taking away other jobs in the energy sector. And this would not just involve solar panels, it would involve retrofits and all kinds of things that would give so many of the different building trades work that they could get. And the district would also be saving money on building costs in the process. And so I truly believe that if the building trades could start seeing real work through programs like this, their support for the Green New Deal will grow. And there's some very good indications that already much of organized labor is already supportive of these ideas. So, in Philadelphia, we're only at the very beginning of this process, but we've initiated conversations with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, local in Philadelphia, and they've indicated they're very open to pursuing this and are excited about this idea. And we aim to keep having conversations with other building trades and eventually come together to write a policy vision similar to what was done in New York, and turn this vision into a real political campaign. So like I said, we're at the beginning of this process, but I think the more we all fight together on concrete issues, even those that don't necessarily have to do with the environment, I think the more we can prefigure the kind of grand labor environmental alliance that we'll need in the future. So I'll end my opening remarks there.
Thanks, Paul. That's a really hopeful statement of solidarity. And I look forward to hearing more about that from the rest of our speakers. So with that, we'll turn to Lara Skinner. Dr. Skinner is the co-executive director of the Worker Institute at Cornell and chair of the Institute's Labor Leading on Climate initiative. Her research, writing, and labor education work focuses on workers and labor unions' engagement in issues of sustainability, climate protection, and economic alternatives. The Labor Leading on Climate initiative advances knowledge, policies, and practices to enhance the role of labor and working people in addressing the environmental and climate crises. The initiative's efforts focus on building a truly sustainable society and economy. She received her PhD from the University of Oregon in 2010 and began her career in labor working with Oregon's farm workers unions, the University of Oregon's Labor Education and Research Center, and as an active member of the Graduate Teaching Fellows Federation, Local 3544. Lara, to you.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks to Paul for those great opening comments, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. As Rebecca said, I'm the co-executive director of the Worker Institute at Cornell in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. We're the New York State Labor School. We were formed in the late 1940s to provide training and education to labor movement, and we've continued to provide research, education, and training to unions and worker organizations for many decades. We do a lot of work in New York, but we also do work in other states and even internationally at times. And in terms of the Labor Leading on Climate initiative that I run, several years ago when we looked at the work that we were doing and how we could be most impactful in terms of building a powerful workers movement, we recognized that the climate crisis was one of, if not the most important social issue of our time, and that we really wanted to be a better resource to the labor movement on these issues. And also that there needed to be a lot more research and study of the labor and employment impacts of climate change, that really wasn't given enough attention. So when I think about, advancing a Green New Deal and the conversations around the Green New Deal, I really think about, excuse me, how do we build the social movement power that we need to demand a Green New Deal and the Green New Deal that we want, and what's labor's role in that? And I think the current intersecting crises of COVID-19, the ensuing economic crisis, growing inequality in general, and I mean inequality in all of its forms, inequality of wealth, power, income, race, opportunity, much more, and this accelerating climate crisis that we're seeing really gives us the opportunity to develop and advance solutions that simultaneously address all these crises, which is what I think we need. And so I think at this moment, we really sort of had this question of, how do we use this really volatile political and cultural moment to build the racially just, equitable, fair, ecologically sustainable economy and society that we want to see. And because my work really focuses on the intersection of the labor movement and climate change, and I really work primarily with unions to help them engage in the public debates and decision-making around climate and clean energy issues, I'm going to really speak to that work and the work that I've been doing with unions over the last few years, and hope that some of the lessons that I've learned from that work can be helpful in our conversation today. And I think most of my work is focused at the state level, but again, I think, developing successful models of labor engaging in climate work at the city and state level, I think will be really helpful for us pushing much more progressive work at the national level. But again, really, we'll lay out sort of the work that I've been doing and then look forward to having more discussion about all of this and take any questions about some of the stuff that we've been doing. So I'll just say that after Hurricane Sandy hit downstate New York and Hurricane Irene hit upstate New York, we really saw that there was an opportunity for us to work with unions in New York State around climate change. And, you know, a number of working class communities were really impacted by Sandy and Irene, are still rebuilding from them. And unions really sort of were on the front lines of dealing with that crisis. NYSNA, the New York State Nurses Association, you know, they were carrying patients downstairs because the elevators were out. A bunch of members of AFSCME, you know, were stranded at wastewater treatment plants because of flooding. Of course, utility workers were trying to restore power. So it was, you know, it really sort of changed the level of consciousness in New York and among the labor movement around climate change. And so we sort of said, not a lot happening at the federal level. Let's really try to focus on what we could do in New York, because there's going to be a lot of attention around how to address climate change. And so, you know, let's have a conversation about what it would look like for labor to more positively and proactively develop its own sort of agenda, a pro-worker, pro-union agenda around climate change, rather than just responding and reacting to proposals that are coming from policymakers, the environmental movement, others. So Cornell, my institute, we worked with the building trades, we worked with the Central Labor Council in New York City and the State Fed, and we convened about 20 unions. And, you know, basically I met with all of the leaders and said, what do you think coming out of these, you know, extreme weather events? We try to put together a pro-worker, pro-union climate agenda for New York State, and we called it a climate jobs agenda. And folks were up for it. There was a real sort of appetite for it. And it wasn't just because of Sandy and Irene that was part of it, but it was also because many of you probably know, you know, solar and wind installers have been the fastest growing jobs in the country for a bunch of years now, although most of those jobs are non-union. And so even in places like New York, we were seeing solar on public schools work being done non-union. And we were just seeing a whole bunch of solar, wind, energy efficiency work done non-union. And that was a real concern, obviously, for the labor movement in New York State. And we were also seeing power plants shut down, fossil fuel power plants shut down, with very little protection or support for the workers and communities that were impacted by those shutdowns. And the workers in the communities were not made whole. And it was really sort of, you know, there's a sense that this transition was going to be borne on their backs. And, you know, I had helped bring U.S. trade union delegations to the UN climate meetings, which was, you know, a really great experience for many of the trade unionists, because you're interacting with really progressive parts of the international labor movement who's doing, you know, really great work on climate change. We had helped develop the just transition language for the Waxman-Markey bill, worked on, you know, sustainable transport issues at the federal level. But we decided that really we wanted to hunker down and try to build out this pro-worker, pro-union climate agenda in New York State. And I would say that there are three things that really made this process different. And we had done a lot of bridge building work between the labor movement and the environmental movement before. But there were three things that made this effort different and that we were very intentional and strategic about doing differently. One is that we led a labor-only process. So we only brought unions to the table to develop this agenda. And we just felt like, you know, labor for a long time, as I'm sure many of you know, had remained neutral or had opposed efforts to do stuff around climate change because of concern around, you know, job loss and, you know, other issues. And we just felt like labor really needed to do this work within its own house to be a better ally and partner to other movements. That was one thing. It was a labor-only process. The second thing was it was centered around building trades and energy unions who were most concerned about how the transition was going to affect them, who were most concerned about job loss. And so we really made an intentional choice to, you know, start with the IBEW Utility Council, with the utility workers, with a whole host of building trade unions who had concerns about the transition and how it would affect them, and really try to center their concerns in this process as we tried to develop out this agenda. And then the third thing, and it wasn't just building trades and energy unions, is say we started the process with them, but had a full range of unions that participated, from the New York State Nurses to SEIU 32BJ to AFSCME Local District Council 37, a whole range of public, social, service sector, and building trades and energy unions. But it did start with building trades and energy unions. That was the second thing. The third thing is we decided that we really needed to think about how we did climate work in a different way. And, it's often sort of presented as, this climate and environmental issue and just a straight up environmental issue. And we really felt that this public debate needed to be reframed to say, we actually are facing two crises. We have the dual crises of growing inequality and the crisis of climate change. And any solutions that we're developing need to be addressing both of these things. So that was just sort of a reframing that we sort of landed on that I think has been pretty powerful in helping us think about how we do this work, but also to our, other allies in the broader social movement in terms of, what we're trying to achieve as we tackle the climate crisis. In terms of how the process worked, it was a multidimensional, multi-year research, education, and convening process. We would convene the group of unions regularly and present new information and data. We started with Climate Science 101. We were very clear that any recommendations that we developed needed to be science-based in the sense that they needed to be ambitious enough to actually tackle the climate crisis at the scale and pace necessary to avoid the worst impacts of it. That's also really important for driving job creation, to have that level of ambition. So that was part of the research. The other part of it was really looking at what is the climate, energy, and employment landscape in New York, and what can we learn from that as we try to figure out how to reduce emissions most effectively in the state, and then what programs, climate, energy programs already exist in the state, and how are they working. And I'll just say this is something that we found in a bunch of states. There are some, fairly decent programs that exist in different states. However, most of them are not being done nearly at the scale that they need to be done to really sort of reduce emissions or create a significant number of jobs. So that's just in terms of, what we were doing in this process. It was a very iterative, we do research, we bring it back to the group. We help the group really understand the climate crisis, what causes it, how serious it is, what we need to do to reduce emissions, and then start figuring out how that lines up with where we had the greatest union strength in the state. And then the final thing I'll say about what I think made this process really successful, and Paul mentioned this, is it was a very jobs-led, investment-led strategy in the sense that we came up with very concrete recommendations about what we wanted to do and how it would create union jobs. And those of you who are familiar with the environmental movement, a lot of the sort of proposals around dealing with climate change are, let's do an 80% reduction below 1990 levels by 2045, that type of thing. And we just felt like that wasn't the right approach to have with the labor movement. And we wanted to focus more on how much solar did we need to build between now and 2030? How much wind did we need to build? How many buildings did we need to retrofit? And how much work would that create? And then even more specifically, what labor standards do we attach to that to make sure that we're going to actually create high quality union jobs? So it's a very concrete plan. We came up with 10 recommendations that would get New York to 100% renewable energy by 2045. And we wrote a report. That's the report that Paul's talking about. It's called Reversing Inequality, Combating Climate Change. It was endorsed by all of the unions that we were working with and convened in that process. And in fact, they were so excited about what we put together that they decided to launch their own organization called Climate Jobs New York. And they've been up and running for a couple years now. I just want to mention a couple of victories that they have had that I think are really important. One of the recommendations that we had developed is that New York State should become a center for the offshore wind industry, that this is a major opportunity for New York to get to 100% renewable power. And so that was the first thing that they focused on, Climate Jobs New York, this union-led organization that launched. And they were able to achieve, they pushed really hard. They worked very closely with environmental partners. They actually were calling for greater ambition on offshore wind than most other environmental organizations in the state. They were calling for 8 gigawatts of offshore wind, and they were actually able to get to the governor to 9 gigawatts. So New York now has a commitment to build 9 gigawatts of offshore wind. It's about half of New York's power, and it includes a project labor agreement. So all of this work, all of the construction work will be done union. So that was like the first victory. As Paul mentioned, we also have focused on solar in schools. We feel like installing solar panels on schools is a really important thing for us to be doing. There are a lot of public schools and public buildings with roofs, with parking lots, with grounds that can have solar installed on them. We should do this at the same time that we do robust energy efficiency retrofits. It's a great way for students and teachers to do curriculum around climate change, to learn about renewable energy. It also lowers public schools' cost. Utility bills are the second highest cost for schools after staffing. So why are we spending a lot of money on purchasing power when schools could actually be generating their own solar power or other renewable power? And again, we said, let's do this. Let's do it at scale. Let's do it for all 4,000 schools in the state. And let's do it under a project labor agreement so that we know that we're going to be creating high quality jobs at the same time. And then the third thing that I'll mention that Climate Jobs New York advanced in New York State, and one is having a prevailing wage on all utility scale renewable energy projects. And you'd be surprised at how many renewable projects are carved out of existing public works agreements, are not covered by any job training or wage standards. So that's been a really important contribution that we've made in the work that we've done. The labor folks who were involved in launching Climate Jobs New York went on in the last year to launch a national organization. It's called the Climate Jobs National Resource Center. My institute, the Worker Institute, is the educational partner to this group. And we are now supporting processes like the one that we led in New York in 4 other states. We're doing this in Connecticut, we're doing it in Maine, we're doing it in Texas and Illinois. Illinois actually launched their organization, Climate Jobs Illinois, 2 weeks ago. And we've already worked together and come up with a set of 10 recommendations that they're advancing to get them to 100% renewable energy by 2045. And it's a wide range, again, of building trades, energy, public service sector unions that are involved in that coalition. So, this is one model, of how to do this work. Again, it's starting at the state level and thinking about how we can do the most that we can at the state level, and hopefully preparing ourselves for a moment when we can really expand this and make it happen at a national level. So, really look forward to getting questions from folks on this. The last thing I want to say is that the other reason I think having labor's voice and power in these climate discussions is so important, besides all of the other things that I've mentioned, is I think that it's really important to recognize that many environmental and climate justice groups, largely led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities in the US, have been pointing out for many years that their communities have been disproportionately impacted by pollution, extreme weather events, and that a big part of building this more equitable, ecologically sustainable economy and society is making sure that these communities have first priority in seeing the benefits from building this new clean energy economy, like having good paying union jobs. And so this is important for the labor movement, sort of envisioning, its repositioning on this issue and its transition into high quality clean energy jobs, but it's also important for all of the communities that have been disproportionately impacted. When we work with environmental justice groups in New York, they very much want to land in high quality jobs in these new clean energy sectors. And so I just think it's really important for us to make sure that these new jobs are going to be good jobs and that there's real commitment and accountability around the communities that have been most affected by climate change and pollution, having an effective pathway into union pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs and union jobs in these new sectors. So thanks, I'll stop there and look forward to more discussion.
Thank you very much for those insightful comments. We'll turn now to Zakia. Zakia Elliott has worked with the Sierra Club Pennsylvania chapter as the program manager of Philadelphia Climate Works, a local coalition uniting community advocates, labor unions, and environmental allies to move the city to build climate resilience through equitable investments in the community and workforce. Zakia was born in Philadelphia and raised in a union family. She has a bachelor's degree in environmental studies from Brown University, where she focused her studies on legislative solutions and public participation in climate change policies. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you everyone for joining us. Like you said, Zakia Elliott. Through Philadelphia Climate Works, we built a coalition to bring residents, members of community organizations, environmental organizations, and worker organizations, as well as labor unions, together to discuss the ways that climate change impacts us, and also to build strategies to mitigate those harms. And we envision a strong and diverse, broad-based climate justice movement that are led by people of color, low-income community members, and impacted workers in Philadelphia to build that more resilient city. We do focus on a range of issues from diesel pollution and transit equity to housing disrepair, energy burdens, and health and safety hazards from waste collection. And today I'm going to focus on our work with sanitation workers. As a climate justice coalition, it's been really important for us to figure out our role in labor climate activism. As a coalition that has a variety of stakeholders together, whenever we try to start tackling an environmental issue, we always ask who is impacted the most and who is at stake here with whatever solutions move forward. So we actually started to approach this conversation with sanitation workers, not necessarily about waste collection, but because of diesel pollution. There was an opportunity on the state level to fund the replacement of diesel vehicles through the Environmental Mitigation Trust, or if people are familiar, the Volkswagen settlement. And we saw this as a huge opportunity to bring cleaner vehicles to Philadelphia, but also to spark electric vehicle infrastructure jobs. And so when we approached this conversation, we wondered, what are the dirtiest vehicles in Philadelphia that need to be replaced? And one of the ones that rose to the top were sanitation trucks, which are very dirty, large, polluting vehicles. And so I reached out to Charles Carrington, the president of the Sanitation Workers, and really started to just ask what the experience of sanitation workers was while driving these trucks. And we learned that the issue is way broader than diesel pollution. And we decided that we really needed to spend more time to understand the issue around sanitation waste collection, as well as the issue of diesel pollution and how it all connects together. So what started as a larger campaign in Philadelphia to replace sanitation trucks, port and airport equipment, and also like the city's fleet of trucks to electric turned into a very targeted campaign around raising awareness around sanitation issues. So we decided to start an oral histories campaign with the workers of AFSCME DC 33, Local 427, our public sector sanitation workers. And we collaborate with Drexel University to help us with the ethnography collection. And so as we started to listen to the stories of sanitation workers, we learned that one, sanitation workers need economic justice and equitable pay for their labor, and that their health and well-being should be prioritized. We also learned that safety gear should be readily available, which it is not always, and that the department should make health and safety decisions in collaboration with workers who will ultimately be impacted. Some of the issues that were rising to the top were like the selection of safety gear that the city made were sometimes in conflict with the needs of the actual workers on the job. So an example of that is like slice-proof versus prick-proof gloves, right? And while there are other sanitation departments nationally that will initiate, say, like a process of choosing new safety gear that is decided upon through the demonstration of workers, the city of Philadelphia does not follow a protocol like that. And so what workers are experiencing on a job are not being adequately addressed through the city. We also found, of course, that the city's use of diesel trucks places a risk on workers and communities, and that the city needs policies and safety standards to account for extreme heat, because many workers were working without working air conditioners, and a lot of our collection happens during the daytime, which can be some of the hottest times of the year, especially during a heat wave. So as we started to move forward on our campaign, we decided to narrow down on those issues. So as we move forward with our Volkswagen settlement campaign, and we sent our comments and started our administrative advocacy with the city of Philadelphia around electric vehicles, we really used that as an opportunity to talk about the needs of the sanitation workers. And in particular, we have been fighting with the city of Philadelphia around piloting, electric sanitation trucks, and how it's especially crucial that as they're moving forward with any plans to replace current trucks with electric trucks, that there needs to be a study on the impact of that fleet onto the workers. And that any trash truck transition should be in collaboration with the workers themselves, who will be maintaining those trucks and who will have to live with the burden of using those trucks. And then finally, as we started to move forward with our history campaign, we had the realization that as community organizations and environmental organizations,
they'll just take it to the back for us.
We need to also bring together our neighbors and our community members to really understand the issue that sanitation workers are facing, which is that they are in need of hazard pay, they are in need of safety gear and new safety policies, but also that residents have a stake also in providing some of these safety measures for sanitation workers as well. So we worked with one of our community partners to hold a chat and chew discussion around the issue of litter and waste. This was within the context of the city moving forward on a zero waste action plan, on initiating several community litter plans. And we knew that while folks are rightly upset about illegal dumping and litter in the streets, that also this was an opportunity to build solidarity between community members with sanitation workers around these issues. And then also, as this year approached and the city of Philadelphia was impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, while we were gearing up for Local 427's expiration of their contract with the city, and we're planning a larger campaign to build power for the sanitation workers, we realized that we needed to take a step back and respond in kind with the needs of the workers in the face of the pandemic. So as municipal workers were pushing for a one-year extension, our coalition pulled together a solidarity letter asking for hazard pay to be granted to all sanitation workers and all essential workers, and that the contracts with AFSCME DC 33 would be extended with equitable pay scales to the other unions that had received their contract extensions at the time. And then also we have continued to elevate the demands of sanitation workers and have elevated their work in kind. And while Charles Carrington, who I've been very lucky to build a strong relationship with over the past several years of doing this work together, could not be here today, he would like to share that he's been the president of the Sanitation Workers Union for over the past 7 years, and that over his years, he has raised the issue of hazard pay and the need for the need to recognize and honor sanitation workers as critical workers in the city of Philadelphia, and that if there's anything that folks could do to support this work, it would be, one, to honor your fellow sanitation worker, your fellow community members. One of the ways that sanitation workers have really felt seen during this time is through residents showing their appreciation for their labor. And this has come in the form of signs in support of sanitation workers. So people are creating signs and putting them up in their windows or hanging them on their own trash cans. Also, during this time, there have been sanitation workers who have stepped up really as the face of this issue. So if anyone is on social media, you might be familiar with Terrell Hagler, also known as Your Fave Trash Man, who has really started to document the everyday life of being a sanitation worker and some of the struggles that they see when it comes to how residents put their trash out, for example, or what the response is in terms of like coordinating waste collection in the face of the pandemic. And through those efforts, sanitation workers have really stepped up and called on their fellow neighbors and residents to help them raise funds for proper PPE. So one of the huge wins that the sanitation workers have made over this past year has been to raise $31,000 to go towards adequate PPE. And they've also just been holding down their own workers in this time, making sure that everyone is well hydrated and fed. And community residents have also supported these efforts by making donations, or folks who are also essential workers in the food industry have coordinated with sanitation workers around these issues. And so if anything has come out of this time is the need to see everyone as a human and to support everyone's labor during this time, and to honor the need for health and safety protections. So also, if there's another big takeaway that I could relay for anyone in the environmental movement, it's to directly engage with the people impacted by an issue before moving forward on trying to put forth a solution. So we had a number of learnings through our Oral Histories campaign, where we interviewed sanitation workers and we learned about their day-to-day struggles. And it really impacted us and helped us to shape the work that we needed to do to move forward. So we knew how to shape our goals and our messaging. We knew how to talk to the city about how they needed to shape their policies and any of their transition work. And we've been able to push forward that any climate issue needed to involve the workers who are going to be directly impacted. And we continue to fight for these issues today. So if anybody is in Philadelphia, I know that Charles would want to leave all of us with the knowledge that their fight for hazard pay continues today. And if you'd like to work in solidarity with them, then you should contact your city council member's office and contact the mayor and let them know that all essential workers during this time need hazard pay, and that especially sanitation workers during this time need to be equitably compensated for their role in supporting a healthy city. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zakia, and thank you for bringing us those messages from the Sanitation Workers campaign as well, so we can support their work. So we have now about 40 minutes. We'd like to open up to a question answer. If anybody in the chat, in the audience has a question, feel free to post it in the chat. just to kind of keep the ball rolling and get us started, one question I'd kind of like to start with that has already been addressed somewhat, but I think it's important to kind of iterate on. So at the moment, we've been talking about how many public sector workers are being forced to work under conditions that make them really essential workers that should have hazard pay, as Zakia was just talking about. The sanitation workers, Paul also mentioned teachers working in schools that need rehabilitation, and postal workers. As we kind of move into the future, we're seeing that the impacts of climate change are becoming more and more apparent and creating other kinds of environmental and worker safety issues. So I'm hoping each of you could talk a little bit more specifically about what kinds of strategies labor coalitions could pursue to make worker safety really a focus and a priority. And maybe if you've seen through any of your work, any indications that worker militancy is on the rise under these sometimes literally life and death conditions. Not sure which of our, Paul, would you?
I can maybe start. I mean, I think it's kind of a good opportunity to kind of revive the movement around occupational safety and health. And, you know, when that movement was developed in the 60s and 70s, I mean, that was a big part of the environmental movement of recognizing the workplace and the environment. And the big shift in thinking was to say, you know, like pollution starts in the workplace, like it ends up in communities, but it starts in the workplace, and the workers are the ones who are first exposed to it. So I think this pandemic has now put that on the forefront of people's minds. So I think there is more of an opportunity now for environmentalists who maybe weren't thinking about labor or the workplace before to realize, like, you know, with COVID, obviously this is now front and center with workers who are doing this during COVID. And even nationally, like all the rhetoric about essential workers, I think like helps that. So I don't know if that actually answered it, but I'll start with that.
During our time moving forward on our oral histories interviews, one of the things that was really important for us was to capture the lived experience and how folks' day-to-day experience provided context around some of those health and safety hazards for folks. Something that definitely came up a lot was like exposures to radiation, for example, and how it wasn't really captured in training. And so a huge strategy around that was to actually build relationships between the workers and with other trainers and researchers around these issues, right? So like our people's observations about their impacts on the job also correlated with research that was already done and with trainings that could be provided for workers. So a tactic that we are trying to explore is to actually hold our own trainings, right, around these things, and to use the experiences of workers as critical points of expertise that we can move forward to pivot and push the city to actually recognize that these are things that need to be addressed.
Rebecca, I can mention a couple of things that come to mind for me with this question. One is I'm working with some folks in Texas, and some of the public sector workers that I'm working with in Texas represent the Public Power Authority. And we've been thinking about how we better address transition issues for workers who are being displaced. And, you know, a lot of cities and states are developing their own sort of climate plans. And sometimes the utilities are even, you know, developing sort of a roadmap to how they're going to transition to address climate change. And a lot of times these don't address any sort of, you know, worker health, safety justice issues. And so I think like thinking about those as an avenue to address these issues is something that we can think about doing. And then also, I know in the UK, they've had, the union movement there has had a big push to have like green workplace reps in every single workplace. And I just think that the more that we can tap into the deep knowledge and experience of workers in their own work sites and how they're going to be impacted by climate change, and how they're already being impacted by climate change and pollution, and what can be done. I think about like SEIU's Building Supers program, what can be done to operate the buildings more efficiently and more greenly. So having, reps or committees in each workplace that are really focused on that might be a way to address these issues as well.
Thanks for those comments. Yeah, I think that this idea of starting with workers, it sounds from what each of you are saying that there's so much knowledge already starting from within the labor unions to build out plans. So kind of going from there, are there any other, so some of you have already talked about current campaigns and current kind of plans in development. Are there any current programs that could be created or expanded on to further environmental justice and economic opportunities? Are there kind of either really nuts and bolts programs that you think would be, should be expanded on, or pie in the sky kind of some utopian visioning for what we would need to see that may not exist? Any thoughts?
I think a basic starting point is to recognize like the private sector cannot be relied on to do all this. I mean, maybe some of it could come from there, but I think there's a reason the Green New Deal is named the Green New Deal, and hearkening back to the best elements of the New Deal. So, I mean, there's plenty of things that we can criticize and limitations of the New Deal, but the basic fact that like we need massive federal job creation. So I think now is the time to be talking about like a federal job guarantee, or something like when FDR employed so many people to plant literally millions of trees across the country. So I think we just should not have illusions that it's going to come from the private sector. Like it won't. And especially, we're in this moment now, it's in a similar situation to the Great Depression, where we don't know what the aftershocks of this pandemic will be, but we know that it's going to be a severe economic situation. And I think this is the time to put forward, like, yeah, the government needs to step in and create jobs to solve this economic crisis, to solve the environmental crisis. So I think we have to be thinking on that scale.
Thanks, Paul. Zakia or Laura?
In the coalition, we always start with what are people experiencing and how can we address that? And this year, Philadelphia Climate Works, we are zeroing in on the issue around housing disrepair. And we've been talking about this issue for the past several years. And I think especially this year with folks being in lockdown due to COVID-19, being safer at home is more important than ever. And it's also harder than ever for people to do. So we're trying to figure out how we address this issue of Philadelphia's aging housing stock, loss of affordable housing, people losing their incomes and having overwhelming energy burdens, workers who no longer have the same jobs that they've had before, the same sort of economic stability that they've had before, now facing home ownership loss, and also thinking about that there's a huge network in Philadelphia of organizations that have been around to do, say, like block builds or to fix people's homes, to provide energy efficiency, and that the need is so great in Philadelphia that we really need all of us to come together to figure out how do we do this? How do we create new jobs through this process? And what's interesting is that there are many different kinds of models for this that are being implemented right now, but we need, it needs an injection of coordination, of funding. It needs to be raised up as a central issue, right? That climate justice requires everyone to be able to live and work safely, right? And so we need to bring everyone to the table, including labor unions, these direct service providers, housing justice advocates, environmental justice advocates, everyone who has a stake and a different lens on this issue to be able to show the fuller picture. That's an issue that I hope that will rise in importance, right? This need for housing justice and how it's related to climate, how it can be also a stepping point towards reducing our carbon emissions through building electrification, but starting with helping low-income people, helping renters be able to stay in their homes, have it fixed up, enter a career path that will be solid, right? Because there is an infrastructure around this that we are trying to impact an entire city here for the next generation on. So there are programs that exist. I hope that we will expand them. One of our upcoming projects is pulling together a working group around this, and we've begun to do this work.
Yeah, Rebecca, I would really second what both Paul and Zakia said. I think that's spot on. A couple things that I would mention. One is, both Paul and I talked about the solar on schools work, and I just mentioned why I think that that's kind of a win-win-win strategy in a number of fronts. And I would just say, like, we need to think with all of these programs, like, how is it an equity-centered approach? And like for the Solar on Schools program, I think that they should be designed so that they start with Title I schools where there's higher concentrations of low-income students, like things like that we can just really be smart about to make sure that we're figuring out how we're creating high-quality jobs, but really sort of attacking the inequality piece of this as much as we can. I think, focusing on renewable generation and energy efficiency in public housing and affordable housing is a big space where we should be focusing right now. We've been trying to think in more rural states in Maine, how do we break into the residential sector? Because in most all places, unions have such low density in the residential sector, yet we really need to do massive energy efficiency work in residential building sectors as well as the commercial. And so, we're thinking, is there a way that we start by installing renewable systems and doing energy efficiency work in households that receive HEAP, which is, heating energy assistance. So for, low-income families who receive assistance with their heating bills. And then the other thing I'll say is just public transit. I mean, public transit is one of the most major solutions to the climate crisis. As I'm sure most folks on this call know, public transit is really hurting right now. Given the COVID-19 crisis, we should be, passing emergency funding to make sure that they have the funds that they need to do maintenance and operation work. And then as part of tackling the climate crisis, a big part of our strategy has to be improving and expanding public transit. It's just such a big, important part of what we need to do to reduce emissions and get people out of their cars. And it's a huge equity issue, right? There's such a large percentage of people in every community around the US that is transit dependent. They don't have cars, they can't afford cars. Public transit is how people get to work, have access to jobs and other essential services. So just, maintaining our public transit systems through this really difficult time, but then really focusing on, how we improve and expand them is really important, including for the reason that Paul mentioned earlier, which is that, a much higher percentage of women and people of color employed in public transit and other public sector spaces.
Thanks. We're getting some questions here from our chat. So we'll turn to Alex's question. Alex says he's been hearing about the Thrive agenda as more appealing to Blue-Green Alliance and other labor folks than the more ambitious AOC Markey agenda, which focuses on fossil fuels, etc. We'd love to hear any thoughts on Thrive. Does it go far enough? Is it a good step forward? And then I'll just add, there's another question in chat also about the urgency of the situation and our labor groups that are supporting Workers' Green New Deal understanding the urgency of the climate crisis. So those two questions are kind of together, if any of you would be interested in tackling them.
I could start with this, the urgency point. I mean, I think, yes, people know, but it's just like where to even start. I mean, you know, and I think at the same time, if unions are right now on the defensive, which most are, you know, if you're dealing with your own contract issues, and then it's like, how the hell at the same time can we campaign around a Green New Deal or something that's so massive as like what it would take? You know, and there's many things you can do. And again, I mean, that's to me what was refreshing about the New York Climate Jobs Initiative, because it was like, all right, here is a clear first step, you know, that many places can take. So, you know, and of course, it's not like I can speak for every union out there, but I think people understand it's urgent. It's just like, you know, this is a really tough political fight, and we don't yet have the power, you know, to get it through. So I think people are trying to figure out how to even start on something that's like such a huge initiative.
There, Zakia, thoughts on urgency or the Thrive agenda as opposed to the AOC Markey agenda?
You know, I have not reviewed the Thrive agenda closely enough to comment on that. You know, I did, you know, provide some input into the AOC Markey agenda, and you know, I think it's quite good on its commitment to high quality union job creation. That said, I think they were responding to a very specific moment, and you know, came up with that pretty quickly and moved it, which I think was great. I do know that the Thrive folks, and particularly Sunrise, who's been really helping with Thrive, has done a lot of outreach labor, and they made that quite a priority over the last few months. And I think that's paid off. And I do know there's a number of folks that have provided a look at it closely enough to provide closer comment, but I do know they've done extensive outreach to the labor movement.
I also can't comment super specifically to the Thrive agenda versus the AOC Markey agenda, but I will say that it's really important for any Green New Deal, any legislation that moves forward, that it be connected to what workers and what community members need on the ground. And so making sure that it's as tied tightly to what people are experiencing and can mitigate some of those harms is what's important here. And regarding this question of urgency, I feel this tension a lot in coalition work. Coalition work is very slow. It's built on beneficial and mutual relationships between organizations, and especially between community, environmental, and labor folks. There is a lot of trust and a lot of space to be had for us to spend time getting to know where we align with values, how we move forward together, how to get our partnerships in the right place so that when funding is available to move forward on this, we already know what we agree on, how to move forward. We've had the infrastructure locally to move this together. And so something that I always say to myself and to my partners is that we really do have to move at the speed of trust here. And while I do believe that the climate crisis is urgent, I think it's really important for us to do this work right. And that requires us to move carefully.
I really like that move at the speed of trust idea. I think that's really, really important. We have another question here from Nina. Nina says it's a question for Lara, but really for any of the speakers. How have you found ways to build solidarity with building and trades unions for renewable energy, net zero construction, for example, and state and local Green New Deal policies?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have a lot more to add than, what I mentioned earlier, which is, we've just tried to engage directly with building trades and energy unions and really understand their concerns and fears around tackling the climate crisis and making this transition, and figuring out what we can do to effectively address those concerns. And obviously, the big one is job loss. If you look at the unionization rates in the energy sector, it's 3% in solar, it's 4% in wind, and, in natural gas power plants and other parts of, the power plant sectors, it's closer to 14%. So it's a significant difference. Of course, those sectors weren't unionized when they started, and it took, long, hard union fights to make them better unionized sectors with, better, safer jobs. And I think the same thing needs to happen in the clean energy sector. And so, besides figuring out how to address those concerns, which is really around just transition, which this country hasn't done well. I mean, we're a country that doesn't have a social safety net. You talk to the unions in Europe and they're like, oh, what do you mean your retirement and your healthcare is linked to you being employed? That's not the case for us, right? And that's parts of Europe, right? That's disappearing in a lot of places in Europe too. But that makes just transition really hard. Like when all of that stuff is linked to you having a job, it's really scary to lose your job in the US, particularly as inequality worsens and the vast majority of jobs that we're creating in this country are low-wage jobs, low-wage, low-quality jobs. So it's scary to lose a job where with a high school education, you make over $100,000 a year. I get that, and this country hasn't done just transition well. Our best sort of attempt at that was the GI Bill. Everything since then has not really sort of met the breadth and depth of displacement that we've seen for workers around industries that have disappeared. So, trying to figure that out, and I think admitting that it's really difficult is part of like moving through that. So that's one part, addressing those concerns. And then I think the second part is, like I said at the beginning, our educational work really starts with, what is the climate crisis and really being real about the depth of it and how quickly it's accelerating and what the impacts are that we're already seeing and can expect to see in just the next few years. And then really sort of looking at where are the opportunities. And most studies say that we're going to need to create about 25 to 40 million jobs in this country to actually do the work that we need to do to tackle climate change. It's a lot of jobs. It's a lot of opportunity for the labor movement to grow and expand. So, just trying to figure out how do we seize those opportunities and, how do we get in at the ground level so that hopefully these jobs can be as good as possible.
Can I just add one thing to that? We're talking about the building trades. I mean, there's this stereotype and narrative out there that, building trades are like the archetype of reactionaries, anti-environment. So, first, we shouldn't buy into that stereotype. I mean, it's like anything else, it's complicated. And I think many building trades have the approach of like all of the above. Like, we want jobs. I don't care if it's fossil fuels. I don't care if it's renewable. I just want jobs. So like, inherent in that stance is an opportunity. So like, it might not be the perfect stance we want, but it means like, again, can we present a credible plan for actual jobs? There's opportunities. So we shouldn't, again, I mean, like the work that they've been doing in New York kind of shows like, it's not like the building trades are this monolithic, like anti-environment entity. So we got to just be careful to not like buy into that stereotype.
I really don't have much to add. Those are really great responses. The only other thing that I would just repeat is that building relationships should be the foundation of anything here, and trying to learn as much as possible. around renewable energy, net zero construction, any concerns at all? Like, I think that it is up to us to try to understand each other's perspectives as much as possible if we were ever to get to a place where we can move forward with a solution that addresses it and serves us all.
We have one more question from the chat, and then I think we might move to closing remarks. This question is from TJ. TJ thanks you all and says, many environmental movements, Sunrise, Fridays for the Future, Climate Mobilization, and Extinction Rebellion often propose climate solutions with little reflection on worker equity and labor precarity. How can we change the narrative of this type of activism? And is that worth thinking about? Anybody wants to start bridging kind of our conversation with some of the more environmental angle on climate activism?
Yeah, I mean, I can start, Rebecca. TJ, I think that's a great question. And, you know, that's really sort of why we have, you know, sort of reframed the work that we're doing around climate to say this is not just about addressing the climate crisis, it's also about addressing the crisis of inequality, inequality of, you know, income, wealth, and race, and other, you know, all forms of inequality. I think that's really important. I think, you know, and you see this both in the environmental movement and in a lot of the agencies within states at the federal level that do climate work. I mean, I think, you know, they really do want to do the right thing on climate, but just don't see their mandate as also dealing with the crisis of inequality. So I think that reframe is really important. And I think the labor movement, as well as the environmental and climate justice movements, are really the right sort of messengers on that. And I would just say that I have seen a pretty significant shift within the environmental movement around this issue. And I think, you know, there's the environmental movement, the parts of it that have received the majority of funding from the foundation world have been big mainstream environmental groups. Are made up of largely, you know, white, middle class, you know, folks. And they've also often had like a very technocratic legal sort of approach to doing this work, which largely has been unsuccessful. I mean, we have not made progress in this space. We've basically been defending environmental laws that were passed in the 60s for many decades now. We don't have any sort of federal climate legislation. And so I think the environmental and climate justice movement has done a lot within the environmental movement to sort of say that, you know, we have been advancing an agenda to tackle economic and worker justice alongside of climate justice for a long time. And I think that's really important. And even among some of the mainstream Greens, I see them focus a lot on jobs issues, a lot more like somebody job could be created. I just think that we're a little bit hollow if there's not any sort of conversation around the quality of jobs that are going to be created. And how workers are currently employed in higher carbon sectors are going to be impacted. So I just think like having plans that actually focus on the quality of jobs that are going to be created is kind of the next step that has to happen. And finally, I'll just say, you know, I think so much of the mainstream environmental movement has been wedded to, you know, very neoliberal market-based approaches to dealing with climate change. And we absolutely have to move away from those if we're going to, you know, actually tackle this crisis in a way that's meaningful and effective and do it in a way that's, you know, building more economic and worker justice.
Paul or Zakia?
Just add a little bit, yeah. You know, it's kind of like a two-way street. You know, I've heard unions complain about environmental groups not including them, and then the other way around. And it's, I mean, I think for environmental groups, one kind of very easy first step is like doing, even just like showing up for labor struggles or events, just to start building a relationship and even just get a sense of like, again, what do people care about? Because again, in any given sector, you might be surprised, you know, it's not always wages and benefits. You know, there might be very particular things for each workforce that they care about. But then from the labor side, there comes a certain point where it can't remain an excuse to say, well, oh, these environmentalists just don't get it. Because I think it's all right. I mean, if that's how you feel, and if that's true, then just you put forward your own plan. And I highly doubt if you did put forward a really good climate plan that included the labor aspect, environmentalists would like disagree with that necessarily. So it kind of goes both ways. Like, I think, yes, environmental groups should have this perspective, but if they don't, I don't think labor can just use that as an excuse, because there's plenty of things you can do, you know, and create your own plan and try to win environmentalists over to it. And I think that could work.
Thanks. Zakia, if you have anything you wanted to add.
I don't have much to add. I think that, you know, it's important to just center people in the narrative. I think many times in the environmental movement, we zero in on technological aspects or the numbers of like where we need to, how we need to reach our carbon reductions. And what actually matters is how we get there, the process, and who might be sacrificed along the way, to be blunt. And that really like refers back to what Laura was saying around like, we're talking about equity here. We're talking about how do we make sure that everyone can survive on this planet and can move forward. And I think that the closer that we get to having a narrative that just embraces people, how do we all adapt to this, including workers, and for especially, I guess if folks are identifying as like environmentalists first, remembering that you're also a worker and that workers are in your life, and the ways that people are impacted by their day-to-day lives are varied. And so this like us versus them narrative that sort of like can get swept up in conversations around environmental movement versus the labor movement, I don't think is very useful. I'm really glad to be a part of like an organization right now where we are unionized. And so, you know, environmental workers are workers, and we negotiate our contracts as well. And so like just having an insight into the fact that any transition in anyone's jobs, any transition in our communities would have an impact on us, and to be conscientious of that and bring that into the narrative. So that goes back to just being careful about how we move together and starting with relationships, right? If I'm talking about a specific solution, I want to learn about how it's going to impact workers too, because I see it as a critical part of making this solution possible. So I would just ask that we, you know, reframe the way that we're thinking about these issues in general.
Thank you so much, Zakia, Paul, Lara. Thank you so much for your insightful comments and sharing with us your knowledge. If you'd each like to take a few minutes and kind of round out your closing statements, we'll close out our teach-in this afternoon. Zakia, can we start with you? You're up.
Yes, first of all, thank you everyone for being here. I really appreciate being on this panel with you all. The thing that I would like to leave us all with is that to get to any sustainable, resilient future, we need to make sure that we are holding each other down and to bridge the silos that we might face ourselves in. I would just urge everyone to continue to fight for us to address the climate crisis by centering the most impacted people first. And that involves us getting to know them, learning about how it's impacting their lives, and then strategically breaking down those barriers and making pathways forward so that when all is said and done, if those folks are safe and well, then we all can be safe and well. Thank you all so much.
Paul, over to you.
Yeah, I guess I'll end by saying, you know, like, obviously the climate crisis is like very disturbing and it's overwhelming, but, you know, we have to find some way to like communicate hope because, I mean, if the message is we're screwed, then no one's gonna, you know, fight with us or think that it's possible. So, and we don't have to be like naive about it. I mean, we can be real, but also just be careful how we're framing it, because if it sounds too hopeless, and you know, we can't get anyone to join it. But if we try to emphasize the opportunities and be careful in how we frame it, you know, I think there, you know, there will be hope. And I just think this upcoming period is going to be so important. I mean, regardless of the presidential election, like we're facing a really bad economic crisis, really bad austerity, which is going to, you know, piled on the austerity that already happened this last 10 years. So it kind of feels to me like this do or die moment, but it really is the opportunity to be like, now is the time of, if ever, to be extremely bold. And, you know, I think more and more Americans are receptive to bold ideas, whether they're coming from someone like Bernie or someone like Trump. I think what's playing out in politics is showing like there is a need for boldness. So I think if we can tie all these things together as, you know, saving the planet as this massive opportunity and jobs program, I think like we can really inspire people. So I'll leave us at that.
Thanks, Paul. Lara, to you?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I really agree with what Paul is saying, and I think I sort of mentioned this in the beginning of my comments. You know, this is a really volatile moment politically and culturally and economically, and but I think, you know, it is a moment of great peril, but it's also a moment of great possibility. And, you know, we've seen so much social movement and activity and direct action around the climate crisis, around environmental fights, so many youth in the streets around this issue, the racial justice uprisings. I mean, I just think like, you know, flexing our social movement muscle is exactly what we need to be doing right now. And, you know, I think more and more conversations are been happening that really sort of think about this as intersecting crises and how we sort of be bold in tackling all of these challenges at the same time. And I just think, you know, it's great that everybody joined this call today. And, you know, I'll just repeat that I think it's so important for labor to have its voice and power in these climate fights. And, you know, excited for us all to be continuing the work that we're doing to make this happen. So thanks for having me join the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists for your really inspiring contributions. And thank you to everyone on the call for attending the second teach-in. If you're interested in any of the things discussed today, please get involved with Science for the People or our climate change working group. The next teach-in will be focused on energy democracy and building our energy future, and that will be on October 25th, which is going to be a Sunday afternoon. And so I think there's some links in the chat about that. Thanks very much and have a great evening and have a great weekend, everyone.